So today we're going to carry on from last week where we looked at the supply chain and started to introduce the concept of value within that supply chain and value creation. We're going to take it on a step. The aim for this lecture is going to be around introducing the concept of business ecosystems and the network and system selling. So last week when we looked at the supply chain, we very much looked at it as a siloed structure with transactions happening from one tier to the next. So the raw materials go to the producers, go to the manufacturers, go to the distributors, on to the customers, be they business to business or business to consumer. This typical view of the supply chain very much treats it as an interaction that is transactional. So one buys from the other with nothing more. Goods flow from one to the next with little consideration of the relationships that happen in between. It also often looks at it in silos. So this organization does a specific thing. The output that they produce goes on to the next to be transformed, and on it goes. Okay, so little view is taken in this traditional view of the supply chain of the capabilities within that supply chain and how actually you may actually create relationships with one another to support each other's business. So to take it on to that next step of looking at it more as an ecosystem rather than a chain, we're going to introduce the role of the business ecosystem. And to do this, we need to understand the role of the participants within it. Okay, so this is an example from Netflix. As we saw from the Marks and Spencer example last week, the Marks and Spencer takes the role of the suppliers within their supply chain incredibly seriously, and they work with them to bring them up to par, stopping them from falling behind and encouraging them to work with each other to improve one another. And it was clear from that example that the relationships between them are incredibly crucial, and that to have that relationship is looking at it as a business network and that ecosystem. So with this example, for Netflix, for instance, you've got the users. So there's Netflix on airlines, the consumers. Netflix actually works in competition with the other streaming providers. So you've got Disney, Prime Video here. But what you realize is that over here, the intellectual property holders, Warner Brothers, DreamWorks, Sony, they license it to their competitors, they license it to Netflix, they produce for both of them. And so the relationship is one where actually the content that flows from the content producers flows to the IP holders. The IP holders own the rights to that content. They then license it onwards. There's also content producers that create it directly for Netflix, as well as the content creators and the relationships they have with both the IP holders and Netflix themselves, who is also an IP holder, so intellectual property. You also have other organizations. So for instance, BMG, they manage the rights for the different content. So Netflix own content, they've got rights management, they've got investment, you've also got things like insurance. You've got all manner of other organizations that exist within this example. Do you see how it's no longer that flow from one to the next, and actually everyone interacts together and the relationship isn't exclusive? And the important thing here to note is that actually often it's circular, and that those relationships have to happen within all the participants of the ecosystem. And I can guarantee you, even those who are in competition with one another often work together. So there's certain industries that actually have a term for it. It's called co-opetition. So United Biscuits does it, where they run each other's trucks. They're running from the same farms, they're running from the same suppliers, they're running to the same distributors. So often what happens is that competing firms put their biscuits and put their produce into the same trucks, and they do backfill each other. So if to stop trucks running half full, they use the same transport system to run both their products together, so reducing costs for both. So whilst they're still in competition with each other on the shelves, actually they're working together behind the scenes to reduce those costs and leverage each other's talents. Okay, co-opetition, that's called. So as well as that, you've got the different platforms here. So if you go back to the Netflix example, you've got things like the cloud service, you've got data centers, you've got everything that goes, the trade show where you can buy and sell your content. And again, there can be content that is cross-licensed from Netflix to other providers. HBO, who's a content provider in themselves, licensed to Netflix. So again, that whilst they're in competition with each other, they actually have a relationship with one another. Also, staff flow between them and back and forth. So it's recognizing that their roles aren't that siloed, fixed flow from one to the next in almost an arbitrary fashion and transactional fashion. In a business ecosystem, in fact, you need to have a look at the system as a whole and the role the participants play within it. As such, there's a model for it. So this is adapted from Moore, 1993, and the business ecosystem comprises of layers which respond to the different levels of commitment within the business. The core layer consists of the parties forming the heart of the business. In addition, in traditional business, this would be run by a single company. However, it can also be formed by a network of several companies, each taking care of part of that core business. So if you have a look at Netflix aren't cloud hosts, they have their cloud host, they have their data centers, they have their banks and their rights management and everything that comes together. So yes, you have the Netflix company, but actually certain things are subcontracted to allow them to actually produce the service. The next layer, the extended enterprise, this widens the view of the business supply chain, includes the customers, complementers and second layer suppliers, as well as the standard setting bodies in a particular field of business. Okay, so for the example for Netflix, you'd have the Advertising Standards Authority to some degree. They don't have direct adverts on it, but they would still be bound with the previews of, for instance, when they preview their other materials, it needs to be age appropriate. Okay, you'd have things like trading standards, you'd have the Consumer Rights Act and the legal enterprises that go around it. Okay, you've got the customers, as we've already mentioned, and you've also got suppliers to the organization. The outermost layer adds things like trade associations, unions. So for the Netflix examples, this could be the Actors Guild. This could be Unison. It could be any kind of trade union that their staff are employed by or their content creators are a part of. Universities. So a lot of providers work with universities in knowledge exchange, so that would be in that wider field. And other research bodies, investigators, stakeholders, so they may have other, so for instance, the Netflix example, you've got the documentaries, you've got all the people who work as investigators who produce that content. And even though they're not directly involved with the business operations, okay, these parties have a significant effect on the success of the business as a whole. So when you're looking at this model, you can bring it down to the core business. So these are the essential companies or the company itself that supplies the core offering. You've got the extended enterprise, and this is where you start looking at the other stakeholders such as the customers, the standard bodies, and then you've got the ecosystem as a whole. So these are investors, unions, research institutes, and other stakeholders around that, and competition, of course. So the business ecosystem, as it says in this slide, suggests that the company cannot be viewed as a member of a single industry, but actually as a part of a business ecosystem that crosses a variety of industries. In a business ecosystem, companies co-evolve capabilities around new innovation. They work cooperatively and competitively to support new products, satisfy customer needs, and eventually incorporate the next round of innovations. So where I mentioned the Netflix example and the United Biscuits example, where competition starts coming into it, you recognize changes happening in the wider environment and you respond to it. And by responding to it together, you actually ensure the sustainability of your own business. Whereas actually, if you all respond to it in different ways, often other innovations can come in and actually get rid of that industry altogether. So the big shift from the supply chain to the business ecosystem, it moves away from that siloed approach taken from that traditional supply chain model. And in that traditional supply chain model, organizations design, produce, and deliver those products to the customers. In business ecosystems, it takes it that step further, and these can include partners, subcontractors, but also the complementers and competitors, as well as the customers and their potential collaborator companies. Okay. It also includes things like the public bodies, the institutions, the universities, the trade bodies, and looks at the wider ecosystem that the organization exists within, beyond just the production of their product or service. Okay. So the traditional supply chain just concentrates on that product and service. The ecosystem looks at the holistic system as a whole that the company plays a part in. Each ecosystem typically encompasses several domains, and it shares with other ecosystems. Its structure is composed of different actors that all adopt different roles and influence their roles and their contributions very separately. And ecosystems are often found whether there is a complex knowledge need and the source of expertise is widely dispersed to create the product or service. So the more complex the service or product, often the bigger that ecosystem is to produce it. Okay, the simpler the product, the smaller the ecosystem, and often that's where it becomes a simple supply chain, whereas actually when it's big and complex, like the Netflix example, that's where there's that knowledge that comes in. So actually those suppliers produce knowledge to produce the end product. Everyone works together to make that end product or service better. So to carry out an analysis of a network, it always begins with a firm. Okay, we look at the actors and the activities and the resources between them. So each step and each company within that ecosystem is analysed as to the actors are who are the organisations and bodies within that ecosystem, what activities do they carry out, and what resources do they have. So you start with that local firm, or focal firm in this case, so that's one and the same. So choose the firm that you want to focus on, and then start mapping that network that's around them. Okay. Activity cycles represent what is done within the network. So what is the role that these actors play within the network? What do they do? What knowledge do they contribute? And what resources are required to perform those activities? Okay, so there's different layers of analysis. And remember that the resources can be combined across the actors. So in the United Biscuits example, whilst they're two different businesses operating with two different business models, actually their core resources are the logistics to get their products and their materials from A to B was a resource that could be combined to the benefit of both parties. So we start with who are the actors, what activities they carry out, and what are the resources that they have to do it. And actually, all of them build on one another. So as resources ebb and flow, so do the activities that they carry out. And each has a relationship that's directly proportional. So if the resources reduce, so will the activities. If the activities reduce, the actor's ability to perform their role within that network can often be reduced as well. So they're all very much interrelated and interpersonal. We look at actor bonds within this. Okay, so the first step is the actors. And the individuals acting within the relationship bring their limits and capabilities to learn and reflect. So what I mean by that is that each organization, each actor within the network brings with it their capabilities, but also the limits. Okay, and which is why that relationship between the different actors are so important, because actually communicating what the limits are enables the core business to understand, okay, so this is exactly what these guys can provide. So who do we need to go to find what they can't? We like working with these people, but they can't do this. So how do we go about finding what others can do to support it? And the actor bonds is that relationship. Okay, they need to have developed trust, mutual trust with one another, respect, and become more and more committed to one another. these commitments can also help orientate resources and activities between them. Okay, so actually, as a company may be running out of money or may not have the manufacturing capability, or there may be issues with the supply chain, because that actor bond is so strong, they can communicate it quickly and early, and actually other actors can also step in to support. Because remember, like we said last week, it's not about win-lose in these situations. We've moved beyond that transactional marketing into relationships, and actually, if everyone survives, everyone can work together and the industry as a whole stands up. But actually, when people start to fail and those resources and skills and abilities are removed from the system, that's when the product starts to falter. So mutual survival is in everyone's interest. And those bonds have an organizing effect on the network. So as everyone works together, the better the success of the organization is. Okay. And like I say, these bonds are incredibly useful in ensuring that the company both survives and develops and identifies changes in the market and responds to them. It's how you build innovation. People working together brings all the different knowledge and resources together to build something new and exciting. And like with that comes also the market knowledge and the market experience and the view of where the customer's going, and everyone working together for a common good. The actual capabilities of the company are as much of a product of its bonds and as of its resources and performed activities. Okay, so if a company have great knowledge sitting within it, but it's unable to produce those bonds with other organizations, those capabilities are no good and will get wasted. Okay, and as such, it can have all the resources in the world, but if it can't create those bonds with other organizations, it won't survive. So we start when we're carrying out a macro analysis of a network, and we look at the economic and social system. So if you remember your PESTEL analysis, so political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. So we start with those macro factors that affect the industry as a whole. So remember, the macro analysis affects everyone within that industry. And the factors that are identified within the macro analysis cannot be eliminated or controlled by the company, but they can be managed and mitigated against. The macro analysis also used to analyze the networks, such as the location of industrial clusters, the family, ethnic networks, business groupings, how the industry evolves, any policy interventions in the economic system. So these are all factors that affect every single organization within that network, okay, not just the organization itself. Well, yes, it does affect the organization. This is looking at the industry as a whole. So it's that outward looking macroeconomics. And that overall picture is developed and it incorporates the system's effects, such as the history and the culture of the organization. So that's the last step, is looking at what is this organization, what's its history, what's its culture, how does the macro environment affect it.